So I want to start off with land acknowledgement, which I think is always important that we do. And we'll talk a little bit about that afterwards, and then we'll dive into some content. I'm not expecting to talk at you for a long time. We're going to open it up to questions and comments, and we'll have a lot of the session will be interactive and conversational. So I am in Huichin, which is traditional unceded Chochenyo Ohlone land. The Chochenyo Ohlone, the Ohlone people live through the entire Bay Area. I'm in the area that's also known as Oakland, California. The Ohlone people have been here for thousands of years. They have lived harmoniously with the land, protected and lived in mutuality with the native, with the indigenous, with the natural life, the animals and plants and the earth itself. And they faced genocidal attacks from white settlers, European settlers and US settlers. And so I claim that partly that ancestry of settler colonialism, which has done so great damage to the Ohlone people in this land. The Ohlone people are still here. They are unrecognized, but they are organized. They're fighting for sovereignty, for land, for the preservation of their culture and language. There's a long history of resistance on this land to the invasion of settlers, of white settlers. So when we do a land acknowledgement, it's important that it's not just a performative act, but actually it comes with a commitment. So my personal commitment is to continue supporting the Sogorea Land Trust, to be paying my annual land tax to the land trust, to talk about the work of the land trust and the Ohlone people in other places where I'm connected in this area, and to show up when needed. There's various struggles going on here around the protection of sacred land, sacred sites, the rematriation of remains of Ohlone ancestors that are housed at the campus here. So my commitment is to continue to show up in those struggles and to be an active participant in that. So think for a minute just to acknowledge whose land you're on and how much you know about that. And what kind of commitment would you make if you were going to acknowledge the people whose land you're on? What kind of commitment would that look like from you in terms of supporting the ongoing, current and ongoing struggles? And I know that there's the Duwamish have a real rent program in your area. Duwamish were only one of many native peoples who lived in the Seattle area, I'm aware, but there is a direct and easy way to show some support. And so I'd encourage you to think about what kind of commitment you would make to paying the rent as we are settlers on this land. And I'm sure there's many other opportunities that you could think about to participate. So, you know, land acknowledgements have been quite a common feature of different kinds of organizations in the last few years. But as Karina Gould, the leader of the Ohlone people here, has said, land acknowledgements need to come out of relationship and a commitment to action, or they're performative, they're rhetorical, they don't mean anything. And so the thing to think about if you're doing land acknowledgements is who are you in relationship with in the Indigenous community? And what are they defining as the issues that are in front of them that they're struggling with and need support? And then what is your commitment to participating in that struggle, in those struggles. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about performativity and rhetorical gestures and things like that in a little bit. But I just wanted to start off because that's an important way to start off. If we're doing racial justice work, it has to start with the land and the people of the land and the displacement of those people over the generations. And of course, that goes back to the doctrine of discovery, which was a Christian doctrine, sometimes called the doctrine of Christian discovery, which in the 15th century set the parameters for genocide against Native peoples, but also for the enslavement of Native peoples and Africans, and for basically the unlimited violence that Westerners were sanctioned by the Pope, who was representing the voice of God and telling European rulers that they had not just the authority, but the responsibility to go out and any land that they came to that was not ruled by a Christian, to invade, conquer, destroy, take their possessions, enslave, to do anything that they needed to do to convert that land to Christian land. And that's still a key part of US law. It's cited in cases regularly by the Supreme Court and by lower courts. And it still guides federal land practices, part of which means that most Native people are prohibited from owning land. They can, quote, possess it, but the ultimate possession of the land is either the US government or private possession. And you can see how great a hindrance that would be to Native peoples to be able to repossess, to take over land that has been traditionally been theirs. So this is one example of the deep history intertwining of Christian dominance with white supremacy and the way that they work together to create a system that puts Native peoples at tremendous disadvantage and limits all of us in so many ways. So I just wanted to start out there. Many of you have been reading my book, having discussions. So I think at this point, one of the things I would just want to talk about briefly is just how we should be developing a racial justice lens. We should, by this point, be thinking, whatever situation we're in, wherever we go, that racism is involved in some way in the dynamics around us. And I know that all of you who are women know that wherever you go, whatever you do, you're aware of gender dynamics, right? And the vulnerability you have as women in different places, from people, from institutional practices, all of that. And so there's something that you have to pay attention to in order to survive, in order to thrive in environments that are set up on a male standard, with men in power, with men as decision makers. And that's what people of color have to do in our society, in a white dominated society. And so if we're going to show up as allies, we have to bring our lens to see how racism is playing out the way people of color do. And a lot of them have written and expressed in many different ways some of the things they noticed and that they would describe, but that's pretty abstract. And we need to be able to look at our organizational practice and say, how is racism showing up here? What impact does it have? How does it influence the policies and procedures and everyday practices of this organization? And when we walk into a room, and it's predominantly white, we need to say, where are the people of color? Why are there not more people of color? And when we look on the walls, or we look on the bookshelves, or we look on the movie lists or the book lists, we need to say, where are the writers of color? Where are the artists of color? Where are the historic figures, leaders of color in our society that aren't on the walls because it's mostly white men who have founded that institution, for instance, or that organization, or white people in general. So one of the things that's really important is just getting into the practice of noticing race and the impact that race has on wherever we go. And I know all of you are in many different settings, some different organizational settings, community settings, athletic, cultural, religious settings. And this is kind of a question you have to bring with you is, how is racism showing up here? And we can talk more about that as we go on in the conversation. And then I guess another aspect of that's the local kind of domestic aspect, but there's also the global aspect. And we need to be thinking about, okay, so how is racism globally showing up? White supremacy is not just a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon that comes out of the colonization by Europe of much of the rest of the world. And so when we look at our foreign policy, when we look at the kinds of policies in European countries towards immigrants, for instance, when we look at the COVID epidemic and the disproportionate effect, access to vaccines, the withholding of the technology to make the vaccines from non-Western countries, these are all impacts of white supremacy as part of a continuing colonial domination by white-led countries. And of course, the tremendous inequalities of wealth is also part of that. So again, we need to be looking at the foreign policies of our country. We need to be looking at what's going on in the world, again, through that racial justice lens, so we can really understand some of the foundations and roots of how that works. And one other thing I want to say, just as we get into more looking at some specific issues, is we're in a time of tremendous leadership by people of color in this society and in many other places around the world, and particularly Indigenous people, but also Black people, Black younger people, Latinx folks, and recent immigrants, queer and trans people of color with disabilities. This is just a brand new period in terms of the evolution of the leadership in visible ways and large and scale public ways. And so there's a lot of opportunity to learn from that leadership, to follow that leadership, to support that leadership. And I think it's a great time to be a white person committed to racial justice, because we have such exciting leadership showing us the way and leading the way in terms of taking risks, of creative tactics and strategies, and of the kind of cultural writing and artistic work that comes out of those communities. So there's no way that we can sit back and say, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on. I don't know who to follow. The problem is there's so much going on that it's a question of, okay, so where do I fit in? You know, what's my piece of the work? Who can I learn from and follow and support? So maybe I should just stop there for a few minutes and take any thoughts and comments, because I'm kind of front loading a lot in the conversation, and I don't want to get too far ahead. So let's just stop. And any thoughts or questions or feelings about any of the things I've said so far? What came up for you as you were listening?
Go ahead, Susan.
No.
Yeah, thanks very much for those preliminary thoughts, Paul. They're great, but they did raise one question in my mind. Mm-hmm. As you said, there's so many places one could choose to work that one person obviously can't work in all those places. So do you have thoughts like around areas that are, I don't know, other criteria we could use besides individual passion to choose an area to work in, like the time, what's happening in that sector, like education or healthcare, or where you see more leverage for white people to have some impact. Any other criteria besides individual passion you could suggest we think about?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. And other people probably have thoughts about this too. So I'll just kind of start us off. I think the place to start with where we're already connected. Think about the organizations that you're in. It might be a school, it might be a PTA, it might be a church, it might be a business organization, neighborhood organization. What kinds of places are you already connected and know people? Because so much of activism and organizing is based on relationships. And if you can start off already with people you know, then you've got a big leg up in this work. It also may be communities where you athletic networks or hiking networks or cultural networks. They may not be organizations so much as networks that you're involved with, that you may be noticing that in the bike rides that you are part of organized biking, that it's mostly white people that show up. And you might want to ask, well, where are people of color and why aren't they showing up for this? Or, just to really think about starting from where you're already connected and involved, because obviously you have some interest there, you also have those relationships. If you've got children, then you're naturally in a set of organizations and relationships around parenting and education. And that's an important one to be doing the work, both in thinking about our own parenting practices, but talking with other parents, thinking about the schools, how are people making choices about the schools, what kinds of racism is playing out within schools or within school districts. Why are things segregated, things like that. I don't think there's any more important area. We need to be doing the work in so many different areas. And people of color are already there doing some of that work. So it's also looking around and saying, okay, in this school district, probably parents and other folks of color are already organizing around racism in the school district. So how can I connect into that in some way if I'm a teacher or a librarian or a parent or whoever? So let me open it up to other ideas, because there's just lots of ways we can come at this. But I hope, Susan, that began to kind of, it's not just a question of passion, but what kind of resources and connections you have. How about other folks? What are some thoughts about finding your way into the work? Yeah, Sarah.
I appreciate that comment because I'm involved with a group called the American College of Financial Services, and they have a president who is an African-American leader, and just more and more being recognized as a leader. But just what I've seen as far as how they're completely reorienting some of their offerings. So this is for all the financial planners and the accountants, and how do you address trust issues around women of color? How do you center things in a way differently than you have? And so having that kind of leadership has just been fascinating. So your comment of how do you support that, of just how do I get behind this organization and behind this president and what they're doing. So I appreciated that. That prompted something for me.
Okay, good. Thank you. Anybody else with thoughts about that?
Someone who is much wiser than me told me a long time ago that personal passion is a perfect place to start in any kind of work, because if you're personally passionate about something, you're more likely to stick with it. The longer you stick with it, the more impact you're going to have. And it reminds me of a friend who's an artist who's gotten involved in social justice issues through the arts and trying to elevate and participate in raising the voices of artists of color. And that's important.
Right. Good example. Thanks for that. I saw another hand, maybe Allison. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I have the football game is coming in out from the background. I hope it's not too loud. But mine piggybacks almost onto what you were saying about the passion, because I have a teen son who plays a lot of sports. So that's an opportunity where we're with a lot of different families from a lot of different neighborhoods. And in the school setting, just the volunteering and finding those resources. And my son went to a grade school that I went to in the 70s, and to see that the school had less color from my time in the 70s to this time now was really surprising to me. And I think that's where the passion comes in, and things that you know and can see and recognize are they're not evolving in a way that you would have expected it to naturally evolve, I guess. And I find lots of opportunities in those settings to participate in different ways, whether it's through groups or, but as you said, recognizing the situation.
Good. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we move on? And I guess there's a handful of people who are not on video. So Andrew, is there a way for them to raise their hands or?
Yeah, they could either raise their hands or drop something into the chat. So if you have something you want to offer, but your video isn't on, you can drop a note in the chat, or just use the reactions button to raise your hand.
Good. Okay.
Well, I can add one other thing. I was talking to a friend of mine, a Black woman, and I asked her this question, if you had a room full of white people that wanted to participate in racial justice work, what would you want to tell them, hypothetically, as if that was a thing that would happen? And what she said was, start hiring Black professionals, find a Black doctor, find a Black owned bank, find a Black pharmacist, And her point wasn't just this kind of like tokenism, feel good about incorporating, but it was more, she was thinking about the ways that we subconsciously believe certain things about people because we have grown up in this society. And so as we encounter folks in these professional settings, it starts to break down some of our internalized and probably unconscious prejudices. And then also the conversations we have with those folks are going to open us up into a different kind of lens and way of thinking and seeing. And even if we don't develop personal relationships with those folks, still just that contact and encounter breaks us out of the largely white environments that we live and move in. And if we have the choice to choose who the professionals that we work with are and where we spend our money, just some of those small choices can just bring us into a different kind of circle of relationships and circle of perspectives.
Right, and just to be a little more specific, that could be your dentist or your doctor or your contractor or your insurance agent or your financial advisor. I mean, we have, again, a lot of everyday choices where to put our resources and where to put our attention and who to support. And so it's really important that we just be conscious of the choices we make and the impact that they have. So let's talk a little bit about this performative or woke kind of, I don't know if woke is the right word, but there is a way that as white people that we want to learn what to do so we can perform it and get it right. and then we've kind of mastered it, and then and that's without any kind of relationship to what's really going on around us, to the people or the institutions that's around us. So a good example, I want to give an example that came up for me this last year. You know, after George Floyd's murder, there was a lot of organizations that stepped forward and wanted to acknowledge, or felt obligated or pressured to acknowledge, Black Lives Matter. And so literally hundreds, if not thousands of organizations, nonprofits and businesses, and even some governmental agencies issued statements in support of Black Lives Matter. And they hadn't been doing anything around racial justice, and they hadn't made even made those statements earlier, right? There's been a lot of other opportunities to make those statements. But when we look at it a year later, a lot of those organizations haven't done anything at all differently, except feel better or made their customers feel better by supporting a business that supports Black Lives Matter. At least they issued a statement. I got a call from a publisher last summer, a year ago this summer, and they wanted to issue a statement in support of Black Lives Matter. And they asked me for some advice about that. And so I asked them, why are you doing this? And they really weren't sure. It felt like the right thing to do, right? And I said, you know, your statement is not going to make any difference. What are you doing in response to this? You know, how are you looking at your internal procedures and the authors that you support and the marketing publicity that you do and the way you hire your staff? You're a predominantly white organization supporting predominantly white authors. And if you could make a rhetorical statement that Black Lives Matter, but there's nothing behind it, it's an empty statement. And so they went back and they had some conversations, and they decided not to make the statement, but actually to go through an internal process to talk about what they could do differently in response, not to Black Lives Matter, but to the issue of racism. Even now they haven't issued a statement, but they have begun to make some changes in their operating practices in this publishing company. So, you know, that's a great example of the emptiness often of our gestures. Or if we do make a statement, then we turn around and look at other organizations that don't and dismiss them or feel superior to them because we made a statement and they didn't, or our statement is better than theirs, or we do land acknowledgements and they don't, or they don't do them well enough. You know, there's all these ways that in a competitive and individualistic and very Christian culture, we set ourselves up as white people in particular to be focused on our own self-esteem and our own moral integrity, not on the impact that we have in the community, not on the difference it makes on what we do. And so it's really important that, and you know, I think again, Christianity has an important role here, because what's important in Christianity at a fundamental level is what you believe and what you intend through your actions. And often I'm with white people, white Christians in particular, say, well, I didn't intend that impact. I didn't intend to hurt somebody. I didn't intend to exclude people. And that's not really relevant to people of color. They don't actually care what our intentions are or our beliefs are, because they're suffering the impact. And they don't, and focusing on our intent can be a way of evading responsibility and accountability to the people around us. So it's really important that we monitor ourselves and support each other and not making empty gestures, not making rhetorical gestures or performative things, or getting into competitions about wokeness, or who's a better white anti-racist ally than other people, for instance. There's just lots of ways that we manage to come back to focusing on ourselves and our own superior, moral integrity. So I'm sure you can think of examples of that kind of rhetorical performance and maybe some of the organizations that you've been involved with. Another example, going back to what I was talking about the doctrine of discovery, was there was a big campaign among Christian denominations and churches several years ago, because of pressure from Indigenous people, to reject the doctrine of discovery. And so a lot of congregations and denominations went through very elaborate processes of education and discussion so that they could, at their plenaries, at their annual gatherings or whatever, they could issue a statement rejecting the doctrine of discovery. Well, that's a first step, but that's not actually impacting the real world in terms of how the doctrine of discovery operates. So now, several years later, Indigenous people are having to go back to those congregations and denominations and say, so what are you doing? How have you implemented this declaration that you made? How have you followed up? And a lot of the kind of denominations are kind of, well, we got stuck. We made this statement, we did this education, and we stopped. And yet there's a tremendous national campaign called Land Back to rematriate native land to Indigenous people. There's incredible organizing around pipelines and resistance and the reclamation of native sovereignty on environmental issues. There's just lots of very concrete ways churches and denominations control tremendous amounts of land. It's astounding how much land some of the major denominations hold, and even small churches may have the land around them in ownership. So there's just lots of ways so there's no lack of ways to actually move forward after you repudiate the doctrine of discovery, but it takes a commitment to following through and making it happen. And that's really, I think, where things break down a lot. So again, let's stop there and have some conversation about what have you seen in terms of rhetorical or performative aspects of white anti-racism, and what kind of feelings do you have about it, or what kinds of things have you seen, things that have moved beyond performative rhetoric?
I see Susan and Nick's hand up there.
Okay.
Thanks. I was thinking as you were speaking, definitely agree with the idea of there's a statement with no work behind it, right? Like clearly a problem, but I have a lot of questions around when, like, the statement when there is some work behind it. So like, it feels like one of the things that we as white people have been called on to do is to, speak out against anti-racism, or to speak out against racism. And so often, I'll give a personal example. So on Juneteenth, I found out about this really cool program at the Smithsonian where you could help transcribe documents from the Freedmen's Bureau that would help Black people with a lot of ancestry research and blah, 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 right? And so I spent the day doing that as sort of my Juneteenth work, right? And then I also posted on Instagram about it, hey, this is how I celebrated Juneteenth, right? And so is that performative? Was my goal, I did the work. I wasn't just hey, you guys should go do the thing, but did I post about it because I really wanted to share that work with other people, and or did I post so that everybody would, be sure to know that I was doing the things, or like sort of what's the mix of that?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure any of us could answer that. I mean, because we don't know where you were coming from. But the fact that you did the work first and then you were telling people about it, I would see as an invitation for other people to join you and to actually do the work themselves. So I would think about it in that sense that, yeah, I did this and it really felt satisfying and it contributed here. Maybe next time you can join me, or some of you all let me know if you want to, find other opportunities, or, use it as an invitation to invite other people in. Makes it a community kind of, it builds the community around doing white anti-racist work. But I don't think that offhand that there's any reason not to let people know. It's good role modeling for all of us as white people in our family and communities and situations, to let people know that not only are we doing things, but it's rewarding and exciting, and it connects us, and and we learn a lot from it. And so as we share those feelings and that excitement, it invites other white people to join us.
Jan, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I think kind of following up on what Susan just said is that it feels like an aspect of white privilege to be able to wait until our motives are pure enough to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
And we spend so much time, and I speak from experience and also seeing other people struggling with this, that we spend so much time purifying our motives, purifying our intentions, that we never get to the work at all.
Mm-hmm.
And for Susan to just dive into it and do it, I don't care if you posted it on Instagram, it's a motive for me. I didn't know about that kind of work. Thank you. So, I think our motives change as we work.
Mm-hmm.
We begin to get a better understanding of what the need is and how we can fit into it as we do the work. And we will make mistakes. We always do.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I have a situation I'd love to get some feedback on. So I'm part of a grassroots environmental organization, and we've started a campaign to replace a fossil fuel based electricity provider with a public utility district. Mm-hmm. And within the proposed public utility district area is the Snoqualmie Falls, which is owned by, the power generation is owned by this fossil fuel company. And our campaign really hopes to rewild that falls, because the Snoqualmie tribe owns all the land and the resort around it. And we were introduced to some council tribal members and had 2 conversations about doing this, and they seemed super excited. And then we haven't heard anything. And I've reached out again, and they said, yeah, we are thinking about it. We'll get back to you. And still, it's been another month and we haven't heard anything. So what do you suggest in a situation like this, where we'd really like to center them in our entire campaign? I mean, the whole new public utility district would be on the land of the Snoqualmie tribe. And it seems like to follow their lead and how this, public utility district moves forward, if we would be, fortunate enough to win, would be really important. And to have them there at the table from the get-go seems really important too.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and a complex dynamic, because you're talking relationships between 2 communities, right, with very problematic history. When you say have them there from the get-go, obviously it got going before they were involved. So this is not something that they were at the original, table for. And I can imagine all kinds of reasons why they would be slow in responding. First of all, culturally, projects come out of relationships in Indigenous communities. And so if you all don't have previous relationships with people in that Native group, then, there's been such a history of promises, broken treaties and promises that, on what basis would they trust you without time and relationship? And taking on something big like that actually calls for a lot of resources from a Native community. And it's not a decision to be taken lightly. And I imagine that there's conversations perhaps about that. What kind of capacity, what kind of expectations, what does it mean? What for us may seem from the outside just a simple yes, we're on board or not, has so many implications and ramifications that we may not be seeing, but that they have to consider because of the long history they've had of dealing with white institutions and groups and with the best of intentions, but without necessarily the leverage of the ability to follow through on the commitments. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that it's been hard to get response, or it's been slow, or hesitant, or whatever. That seems like a reasonable thing in a process like this of such magnitude to slow it down and to actually explore some contacts in the Indigenous community to actually build some relationships around this. Because in the long term, that's the only way it could really work anyway. Otherwise, they would definitely be disenfranchised in the process. So that's just some initial thoughts. Do other people have some sense of this kind of situation and what might be appropriate?
All that rings true with everything that I've been told. And I would also say that as noble as the organization's efforts might be, it's, I would just underscore that the Indigenous folks that you're meeting with now were not at the table when this idea was created. So that makes a difference. And it's really important to center the community's needs and well-being. So if you really want to put them at the center of this, then that is going to take time and relationship.
Just having lived among a different First Nations community, things do take longer, and it seems the Falls is a place where there are really complex relationship issues. It might be good to go in with curiosity about their relationship with the Falls and with Puget Sound energy over the years, to listen to what their concerns are, so that you might make sure that what you're doing won't reopen an old wound, even though your intentions are very good. Before asking for their commitment, ask for the history.
One of
Thank
the
you.
things, good.
I was just going to say that I think that's very important. And it's not just ask for the history, but know that we represent a history when we show up as white people, as a government, as a state. And so when the trust isn't isn't automatic. Trust is built over time through relationships, and there's such a history of exploitation and manipulation with white Indigenous relationships that we have to realize we carry that into the room with us, regardless of who we are personally. And I think that that's something that's true with racism in general. That when I walk into the room as a white person or as a white man, that I represent a whole history of relationships that people of color and white women around me have had with people like me. And that I'm not responsible for all of that history, but I have to take into account that that lives in the room between us and within us. And so, Pastor, you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I see you, Jessica. I just wanted to say that one of the challenges when we center relationships, I find, is number one, we have to set down our sense of urgency, which, as we've been learning in our group, is one of the norms of white supremacy culture. And so we know we need to grow out of our constant sense of urgency and needing to do this right now and see ourselves as part of this broader time frame. But one of the other things about centering relationships is oftentimes we are asking a lot of people that we don't know to invest in us. And I think this is one of the big challenges for me around this, especially living and working in largely white spaces, is this knowledge that I know that I don't have the relationships. And so there's always this strange, like, I don't even know how to articulate it, but like we go out and say, hey, I want to be in relationship with you. And there's like almost putting an expectation on someone. The like really horrible part of it is like, you should want to be in relationship with me because I could have blah, blah, blah benefits, access to power, privilege, resource. Like that's the garbage thinking, but it shows up in, even when we talk about centering relationships, all of that baggage still shows up. And I'm wondering if you've found some strategies for undercutting or eroding some of that thinking as we center relationships.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I know exactly how to answer that. I mean, it calls for self-reflection, but it also calls for some having some other white people around you that can actually question what you're doing, like this conversation tonight. That we need to hear each other's voices about our own behavior and our own expectations. So I think, you know, we can do some on our own, but this is really where we need to look to each other for that.
I just feel like so often I want to be in more relationship. And so like with the Duwamish tribe, for example, I almost feel awkward asking for time from folks, especially in leadership in the tribe, because I know they have so much to deal with. Mm-hmm. And so I know that I need to show up ready to make my own commitment of what's the gift I'm going to give, instead of expecting them to give me the gift of their relationship. I just always find that there's this, I almost have an easier time when I encounter someone randomly rather than when I look for someone specifically to be in relationship with. It's just always so much easier when it evolves organically, but because of white supremacy, we tend to operate within environments that are extremely racially and class segregated. And so it's a very rare moment where we encounter someone, especially a person of color, especially someone from a different socioeconomic kind of class basis from ourselves, that has an organic feel to it rather than purposeful. But maybe that's just a bigger issue. I don't want to negate what Jessica had to offer.
Sorry, you weren't negating. I was just sort of putting a spin on something. When you were talking about you carry the weight of being a white person when you walk into a room. My daughters and I were just recently having this conversation that at this point in time, as a white person, when you do come into our world, our vicinity, there are pauses now in place. The perfect example was a gentleman at the tire store. I was waiting for my car to be serviced, and as I'm sitting there watching, there's a gentleman who walks in, and he's a beautiful, tall, white, kind of balding, sort of gray bearded, the kind of man that would catch my eye. But immediately what stops me in my tracks was he had a tattoo in German on his arm. Right now, that immediately to me he carries this weight now that I don't know what he is about, and I'm sure he was a very nice person, but suddenly the roles I'm seeing are sort of reversed. That I've been carrying that very weight as a person of color, in a lot of times the only person of color in my schools or my family for a little while there. But it comes with some significant thought, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. The other thing that we haven't talked about in this case, and then I think we should keep moving on, but Native communities are very complex, and they have complex politics. And when we come to a Native community and assume that there is a spokesperson or a policy or some kind of decision-making structure, unless we're in relationship with that community and know something about it, Native communities are very diverse in so many ways, and often don't have agreement and have different factions within them. And so to show up and say, this is the community we want to work with, and I find that locally here in the Bay Area, even in like a casino or a project, there may be very competing factions within a particular community. So again, without relationships, we don't know who we're even dealing with and what's behind those people, and what, so there's just so many ways that we have to step back and ease in and start showing up, because Native peoples and people of color in general notice what we do. And when you show up regularly in support and not claiming attention, not wanting access to leadership, but just in support, then they recognize that. And at some point that will ease into relationships that can be pretty transformative, but that's what they're looking for. Yeah, Dick. I think you're on mute.
I can't help you. You got to push the button. There you go.
I think this is a great prime example. He said, I acknowledge you, Jessica, and then turned around and talked for 3 minutes. Where are we? Where are we doing? This is what we're talking about. We've got one Black person in the room and he acknowledges her and then he goes on and talks. This is white privilege. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Duly noted. Any other thoughts or comments?
I have one comment. When Indigenous people do invite us in, like we have the Puyallup tribe here, and Tacoma, and they've got an issue with the liquid natural gas project down there at the port, that we all gather together and we support them. They ask for support from us, so we support them. The Lummi Island Nation, when they need support up in Bellingham, when they ask for the support, we jump in and we support them. I see a lot of us here that do participate. So I think if we're just more supportive when asked. So.
I also think a lot about what Brian Stevenson says about proximity, that we can't be in relationship with people we're not proximate to. And so one of the challenges that I've been thinking about a lot is how do we build in more proximity, just more spaces where we can have contact with folks. And I feel like that really challenges me to step out of a lot of my routinized and normative ways of being in the world to be more proximate, because my world and my environment really is structured to be separate. And so I've been just trying to think creatively about how do I end up in places where I'm going to encounter folks. I know some folks on this call do some work at a place called the Heron's Nest that's very near to the Duwamish Longhouse. And there's just some of those spaces that I think I could be more intentional about being present in, that would make kind of that more organic contact more meaningful. Because I totally hear what you're saying, Paul, about like seeking out leadership and trying to find the powerful people. And that's really about affirming my own sense of importance rather than authentically trying to cultivate relationships. So I appreciate that point. Thank you, Paul.
Some of us live in communities that are largely white. And I'm fortunate that my community is getting more diverse, but most of the diversity comes from a fairly well-to-do Asian population. And I make friends, and sometimes they'll ask where I worship, and I'll tell them. And if they come, they're not going to see anybody who looks like them. So one of the things I do when I get a chance to do the slides for Sundays is I try to bring in pictures of people who don't look like me. So that when my Japanese friend or my Indigenous friend comes to church, there's a chance that at least in the slides, he or she might see someone who looks like them. I think if you've never had the experience of being in a church where you are the only white person, you might not understand how awkward it is to walk into some place where nobody looks anything like you. It's a small thing, but it's a way of making the space more open to everyone. And it keeps reminding us that not everybody looks like us.
Not a small thing, Elizabeth. Don't sell yourself short.
Yep. There's a lot of little things like that we can do to make our spaces more welcoming. It's partly who's on the walls. It's what music we play, what food we have, who's welcomed at the door and who is just kind of ignored, who sees themselves in front of the congregation or the front of the meeting and who isn't. There's just so many ways that, little ways that, as you said, make a difference. And we really need to be, because people walk into a room, you all, I'm sure, have walked into rooms where you just felt unwelcome. It may be because of your ethnicity or your gender or your ability or age or whatever, but you just could feel that this wasn't a place that people expected you to be, right? There wasn't a welcome sign here, come on in. And other people you saw coming in and the welcome sign was wide open for them, right? So it really does create what I call a culture of power in our organizations. And it's about who is in charge, who is respected, who makes decisions, who's seen, who's listened to, and who isn't. And so those things that we can do to break down that culture of power and to actually challenge it within the group really are important. Any other comments or thoughts about any of the things we've been talking about?
Lynn just dropped into the chat a question. When are those diverse representations considered tokenism or cultural appropriation versus trying to be more welcoming?
That's a really good question. You know, ultimately, the deciding factor is how do people who have been excluded feel? Are they just seeing a token representation but no real access, no real decision making, no real voice? Or is there a meaningful shift in the culture of power so that it's not just tokenism? And cultural appropriation, again, in terms of race that we're talking about, people of color get to decide that. Indigenous people, Black folks, Latinx, Asians. As white people, we can't decide those things or necessarily have a good understanding of what the implications are. So that's yet another reason why people of color need to be in leadership and be full contributors and participants in our organizations, because otherwise it can very much end up as either tokenism or cultural appropriation. Other thoughts? I'm sure lots of you have thought about this some or seen situations which either were or were not tokenistic.
Go ahead. I see that you unmuted.
Okay, I just wanted to say that since I was a teenager, I have spent a fair amount of time of my life in African-American churches, sometimes been the only person, sometimes with my entire family been there. And, you know, they are welcoming. I have often wished that many of our UCC churches could have this kind of a welcoming feeling when you get there. And I believe that in Keystone we do. That's one of the things. I have a husband who keeps saying it's the friendliest church we've ever been in because people do welcome one another. But I have never felt excluded or, you know, out of place as an only person in an African-American church of hundreds or thousands of people. Not usually thousands, but sometimes in Phoenix.
Many hundreds.
So many hundreds. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to be that welcoming to everybody who comes into any of our churches.
Thank you. David, I saw that you had unmuted. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, it was partly to call on the folks that unmuted, but I'll also add that just one thing that I'm sort of hypersensitive to it now, because having read the Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture by Tim Oakland many, many times, and like I do that perfectionist thing where I'm constantly sort of policing or refereeing myself, like, oh, I did this thing, I did that thing. And one of those characteristics is sort of setting up a binary constantly. And I've noticed, and this is natural, right? Because this is the society that we're in, that a lot of the discussion and a lot of the questions like that we've asked tonight and that I find myself having are set up as binaries, like it's tokenizing or it's inclusive. And what popped into my head is that it can be both, right? It seems like it's going to depend on how it feels to the person who's experiencing it, and that ultimately the way that I have learned and am constantly working on to sort of figure that out is to be in relationship with that person or with those people and check, right? To ask for the feedback and ask how it feels. And be ready to hear the answer that it felt pretty tokenizing, but it was also kind of nice. Like, that's going to happen.
Or maybe two different responses from two different people. One who feels, wow, I felt really welcome, and the other person feels, wow, I didn't really feel welcome at all. So again, we don't want to generalize to communities as if they have one voice.
I want to just mention that I realize most of you don't know me. Sarah Finney invited me, and I came to hear you, Paul, before, and then other than that, I've not been part of this group, but I should probably just identify that I'm an extremely white passing Latinx woman. And so I can move pretty fluidly through lots of different spaces, which is an interesting experience. And to the binary comments that you made, David, about white supremacy characteristics, it reminded me of something that was said earlier this evening about when we do announce our work to other white people about our anti-racist work being rewarding and exciting. My emotional reaction was, well, recently for me, it's been horrible and frustrating and demeaning and, mind-boggling. And both of those things can be true. And that there's kind of this white fragility piece around having to find the rewarding and exciting part of anti-racist work to convince other white people to get involved. When, I'm sorry, but if it were easy to do, it would have been done centuries ago by the people of color who've been suffering under this oppression. It's not easy to do, and just because white people are now getting woke and involved doesn't mean it's going to be easy or fun or rewarding. And sometimes you're doing the most important work when it's the most frustrating. And somehow we've got to tell people that's exactly why you have to do it. It's because it's the right thing to do. And BIPOC people are exhausted, and it's beyond time for white people to step up and join them.
Thank you. Yeah.
Paul, one of the things that you talk about in Living in the Shadow of the Cross, which is also all over uprooting racism and is really, I think, a new part of the conversation about white anti-racism, is this issue of defending our goodness. There's a book called Good White People that Sullivan, I think is the author, Shannon Sullivan wrote, where she talks about how so often white folks develop their this performativity that's really about defending their own moral goodness in the face of the reality of white supremacy. And that I think that a lot of the time, the performative wokeness and the optical allyship, as Saeed talks about, is really about trying to make sure that we reaffirm our own goodness, even as we're complicit in systems of evil, if I can use that language. And so what I wanted to ask you about, because you talk about this a fair bit in this book and talk about how Christianity and Christian theology has really reinforced, like you said, the pieces about intent and personal goodness and personal morality. How do you see white anti-racism coming out of this moralistic paradigm and this being a good person paradigm? Like, where do you see some kind of opportunities to get beyond a moralistic framework so that we can show up and care about relationships versus about our presentation or our own moral integrity?
Well, that's a good question. It's also a complicated one. But I mean, I think we're all aware that Christianity, dominant Christianity, has a deeply binary worldview, right? Good and evil, God and the devil, sinners, and the saved. We could go on and on. Our language is built around binaries, and white supremacy really has adapted that binary. There's white people and everybody else. And the problem, I think, comes from the individualism behind that, coupled with the binary, because we're also deeply socialized to think about our own personal salvation and our own personal moral integrity. And of course, those are important things, but when that's what we end up defending, as opposed to our actions in the world, our actual practices, how we actually show up, then it becomes a denial of our community, our relationships, our interconnectedness and interdependence. And so it really calls for, I mean, I think it's kind of a psychological / spiritual maturity to be able to get a perspective on our limited or the ways that we're not able to get out of our own lives, not able to actually embrace the world and our interconnectedness in a way that drops those walls of separation. There's just so many ways we, quote, demonize other peoples. We see this in our culture and our media all the time. And the rhetoric is always about those people, whether it's people with disabilities or recent immigrants or Muslims or whoever. I mean, we have a whole range of categories of people who are defined as the other against a model of a white Christian male who's defined as normal, moral, upright, intelligent, a natural leader, all of that stuff. So again, I think it's part of our personal work, but also we need to be supporting each other to actually lower the level of the egoism and build the muscle of connection and community. And really, there's so many passages in the Bible about welcoming the stranger, recognizing ourselves in the stranger. I mean, that's one of the most common phrases. And yet, that's really hard to keep in front of us in a society that mitigates against us feeling that actual commonality with other people. I'm sure other people have thoughts about that. So let's open it up again. What comes up for you when Pastor Andrew raises that kind of concern about the limits of our ability to get beyond our own ego, sense of self as a moral person?
I think for me, and one of the ways that shows up is how I wanted to distance myself from other white people because I didn't think they were where I was, right? And I think that's a real danger. And when I think about my passion would be to go to white people who are more curious, perhaps, or who I think are more curious, than to go towards those that I really have to call on my own, I don't know what you would call best self, to be curious, to really authentically be curious instead of make up a narrative and write them off. And I think that's really something that I still have to really be attentive to as a white person, is to not go writing people off, because that's also kind of to make me feel better, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I completely agree with you, Diane. And I also would just say that from my experience about this, what I call this parallel universe that I'm operating on, it feels like sometimes with people who have a very, very different view about what's going on in the world. And so trying to build that bridge where I'm not feeling morally superior, but I also just like, wow, it's mind-bending. So trying to figure out how to not feel like I'm superior, how to keep doing the work of remembering that we're in relationship, as long as we don't talk about politics, as long as we don't talk about this. So yeah, I don't know. That's my continual work.
Mm-hmm.
So, responding to Diane particularly, I was involved with a group that was trying to do anti-racism work, of course, in response to the murder 2 years ago now, my God, a year and a half ago. And they worked very hard. And we started with reading White Fragility. And, I've been working on this. I've been doing this kind of work for like 20 years, 25 years. I have had some pretty challenging life lessons from some anti-racism workshops that took me years to process and finally go, oh, that's what happened in that situation. And what I was seeing in this group was people who were very, very new to the work and didn't really, were having a hard time absorbing what we were reading. And in every chapter in that book, if you've read it, there's a chapter about white women's tears. There's a chapter about each of the kinds of the manifestations of white fragility. And every time we read a chapter, somebody in the group would act out that particular characteristic of white fragility. I can see this because I've been doing this.
Jan, you muted.
Yeah.
Jan, you muted yourself. Or
Okay.
Someone muted you.
So yeah, I learned this like 25 years ago when I was called on it by a Black woman in the group. And and I did White Women's Tears. But how do I keep from being the moral scold in a group like that when I can see what's going on? I don't know how to respond in a way that's constructive.
That's a good question. Anybody want to jump in and some ideas or thoughts about that? Nick?
Yeah, so something that I've heard a few times in this call just about the importance of action over the way you feel about something really strikes me. And this question about sort of escaping a sort of a moralistic point of view on what we're doing is very striking to me. And I don't mean to say that as if like, oh, I figured that out. I mean, I haven't at all. But I see myself in some of these challenges about like, oh, what is the right thing here? And then what's my role in recognizing that in myself and other people? And maybe that's not actually very important as so much as it is these questions about building relationship with communities, people, and making a difference over making statements or like, you know, having a moral judgment of myself or other people. That's sort of where I'm at right now anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll piggyback since we're unmuted. I have been in a group where we talk a lot about how we love to add moral judgments on top of things, but how can you observe sort of like they use the term workability, like if I go to bed way much later than I thought, I'm not like inherently a bad person or like inherently a good person, but it's going to make my morning a lot less workable, right? You know, it's like going to make the things that. So I wonder if you can like, how can we might feel that, you know, doing all these things, you know, exhibiting all those problematic behaviors is like bad or immoral, but how can you convey the message of, you know, you're doing this thing without also overlaying the moral, you know, the moral flavor on top of it, and just saying, you know, like, here's the thing you're doing, it leads to the following outcomes, or like it might not be, I don't know, like rather than saying you're doing that thing and that's what bad people do, you know, just like observe it in a very neutral way and then like tie it back to the reading that you're doing if that's the context, which I think is hilarious.
Can remember where you were 25 years ago when you started, and maybe some of the vulnerability of that time, and share, you know, I see in you something I saw in myself 25 years ago, and just be vulnerable enough to let them connect with you. And then if they're interested, you could say how you got from there to a different place. But honestly, stepping back into your shoes 25 years ago is a big challenge sometimes.
Well, I think that one of the values of Surge, showing up for racial justice, is calling people in. And I think we need to keep in mind that these are not one-time conversations or unique dramas or dynamics, but that we constantly want to find ways, like you just suggested, Elizabeth, to pull people in, to welcome them, to you know, hold them gently, because we know it's a learning process. We know it's a path that we're on, and we're all in different places, but we all started way back there, you know, at some point. So it always helps me to think about, you know, am I calling people out on this, or am I actually calling them in because I want them to join us in making a difference and changing the world? Any other thoughts about Jan's question?
I don't have
Go ahead.
don't really have much to add. I just know that I was in a similar situation, but recently, but was brought up short. And it always, I guess it is always helpful to me to say, but what am I curious about? Where's my next place of growth? And can I be following that path while you're following your path? And so we're all learners together, because, you know, we're not done. So they're just, it just feels so, I don't know, Buddhist, like that always having to start over, always being in that that spiral where we can go deeper on the same questions.
Well, and this is, we need to wrap up. But this is some of the work that people of color are asking us to do, is to talk to our families and relationships and other white people, and have these conversations and step up and make mistakes, but with kindness, with an invitation to get involved. So it is time for us to wrap up. You know, none of us are perfect. And it's not about making mistakes. Of course, we'll make mistakes, but often what we don't realize is that we're making mistakes anyway, right? We're messing up anyway. We just don't notice. And it's a gift when other people tell us that we've messed up, because then we can actually change, right? So it also, I think, helps us to be appreciative of the time and energy that people take to correct us or to challenge us or to gently guide us into a better way of, you know, doing this work together. And that's not an easy place when you've been called short, you know, or called up or called out in some way. And, you know, I tend to feel embarrassed and like I've messed up and awkward, but it really is a gift. And it's the hard work that people of color do a lot, but it's the work that those of us who are white can take on, especially with each other, to do, because we aren't fragile. I mean, that's the thing about white fragility, is it's a fake fragility. We're not at risk. Our lives are not at risk in this sense anyway. And we tend to think, we'll overestimate our own fragility and the fragility of people around us. And that is not a useful place to be thinking about social justice from. So I understand you have a couple of more sessions. I want to just remind folks that I can be a resource, and I'm easy to find. My email address is just paul@paulkivel.com. And I wish you well continuing your journey, and please use me as a resource. And thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Thank you so much. I invite everybody to just unmute and just say thank you to Paul. We really appreciate you giving us the gift of your time and your wisdom, and we will stay on this journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you very much. You'll stay on this journey.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.